The most dangerous mistake a powerful person can make is assuming that silence means weakness. Rain hammered against the tall windows of the Meridian Room, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, turning the city lights outside into blurred ribbons of gold and silver. Inside, however, everything remained immaculate. Crystal chandeliers reflected softly against polished marble floors. Wealth moved quietly between tables in tailored suits and designer dresses. Conversations about mergers, investments, and private aviation floated through the air alongside the gentle sound of jazz. Claire Bennett moved gracefully among the guests carrying a tray of sparkling water glasses. At 34, Claire had worked at the Meridian Room for almost 3 years. Her uniform was simple. Black dress. White apron. Hair neatly tied back. Most guests barely noticed her. Those who did usually remembered her for one thing. She listened. In a city where everyone wanted to be heard, Claire had mastered the rare art of listening. That rainy Thursday evening had already been unusually tense. Several employees whispered nervously near the kitchen entrance after learning that Ethan Caldwell had made a last-minute reservation. Everyone in New York knew the name. Ethan was a billionaire technology founder whose companies had reshaped entire industries. He was brilliant. Demanding. Intensely private. And according to restaurant staff across Manhattan, not especially kind when frustrated. At precisely 7:15, Ethan entered the restaurant. Tall. Distinguished. Silver beginning to appear at his temples. His charcoal cashmere coat still carried droplets of rain. 2 assistants followed behind him, speaking urgently about a failed acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethan barely acknowledged anyone as he removed his coat. His expression alone warned the room that tonight would not be easy. Claire was assigned his table. "Good evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said warmly as she approached. "May I begin with still or sparkling water?" Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to documents spread across the table. "Sparkling." Claire poured carefully. "Would you like a few additional minutes with the menu?" Ethan finally looked directly at her. "Do people actually come here for the menu?" Claire smiled politely. "Some do, sir." Ethan gave a quiet humorless laugh. "Interesting. I assumed people in your profession simply memorized recommendations and repeated them all evening." The comment hung in the air. Nearby conversations momentarily softened. Claire remained composed. "I do have recommendations, sir. But I have found that preferences are usually more interesting than assumptions." Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he returned to his papers. "Bring the ribeye. Medium rare." "Certainly." Throughout dinner, Ethan remained visibly irritated. Phone calls interrupted the meal repeatedly. One conversation ended with him closing his eyes in frustration and placing his phone face down on the table. Claire approached with fresh coffee. "Would you care for dessert this evening?" Ethan looked exhausted. "No." Claire nodded. "Very well." As she turned to leave, Ethan spoke again. "Tell me something." Claire stopped politely. "Yes, sir." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Have you always worked in restaurants?" "No, sir." "What did you do before?" Claire hesitated briefly. "Many things." Ethan smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in it. "Let me guess. Life happened. Plans changed. And now here you are." Claire said nothing. Ethan continued. "You seem intelligent." "That is unfortunate." Claire remained calm. "Why unfortunate?" Ethan folded his hands. "Because intelligence without opportunity rarely changes anything." He looked around the elegant dining room. "People like you usually stay exactly where they are." Complete silence settled across the nearby tables. A businessman seated 2 tables away slowly lowered his wine glass. Even the pianist seemed to pause between notes. Claire stood perfectly still beside the table, rain cascading against the windows behind her. She neither flinched nor looked offended. Instead, she met Ethan Caldwell's eyes with remarkable calm. And then, with a gentle smile, she prepared to answer. For several seconds, no one inside the Meridian room moved. Rain continued striking the windows in steady rhythms while crystal glasses reflected warm golden light across the dining room. Claire Bennett stood beside Ethan Caldwell's table, one hand resting lightly against the coffee pot she still carried. Nearby guests pretended to focus on their meals, yet nearly everyone was listening. Ethan maintained eye contact, apparently confident that his observation had ended the conversation. Instead, Claire offered a small, almost thoughtful smile. "Position and value are rarely the same thing, sir," she said quietly. The silence deepened. Ethan frowned slightly. It was not the response he had expected. There was no anger. No embarrassment. No attempt to defend herself. Only calm. Claire gently placed the coffee pot back onto the table. "Some people remain in the same place because life requires it," she continued softly. "Others remain because they choose to." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "And which one are you?" Claire's expression remained warm. "I have learned that assumptions are usually expensive." Several guests exchanged glances. A woman seated nearby lowered her menu to study Claire with new interest. Ethan looked almost amused. "That sounds rehearsed." "No, sir," Claire replied. "Only experienced." Ethan studied her carefully for the first time that evening. Most people reacted to him predictably. They became nervous. Defensive. Eager to impress. Claire had done none of those things. Instead, she seemed entirely comfortable standing exactly where she was. Something about that unsettled him. "Tell me," Ethan said after a moment, "if intelligence and hard work truly mattered equally, would you still be carrying coffee at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night?" Claire considered the question seriously. "Possibly." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Possibly." "Success depends on how someone defines it," Claire said. "My definition may be different from yours." Ethan gave another quiet laugh. Spoken like someone who has never managed a corporation. Claire simply nodded. "That is certainly possible." Ethan's assistants returned to the table carrying updated documents. One immediately sensed the unusual atmosphere. Ethan barely acknowledged them. His attention remained fixed on Claire. "You know," Ethan said, "I built my first company from a one-bedroom apartment with $7,000 and a borrowed computer. I did not have family wealth or influential connections. Opportunity did not arrive politely. I created it." Claire listened attentively. "That is impressive, sir." Ethan folded his hands. "Which is why I struggle to understand people who settle." Claire was silent for several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice remained gentle. "Not everyone who pauses has settled." Ethan said nothing. Claire continued. "Sometimes people step away from one path because someone they love needs them more." Ethan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Before he could respond, a distinguished older gentleman seated nearby suddenly stood and approached their table. "Forgive me for interrupting," the man said politely. "But I could not help overhearing." Claire immediately recognized him. Professor Richard Lawson. Former Dean of Economics at Columbia University. He smiled warmly. "Miss Bennett. It is good to see you again." Ethan looked visibly surprised. Claire returned the smile. "Professor Lawson. It has been a long time." The professor nodded. "Far too long." He turned toward Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, I suspect you may not realize that you are speaking with one of the most gifted students Columbia's economics department has produced in decades." Complete silence returned once more. Ethan stared at Claire. "Excuse me." Professor Lawson smiled. Claire published groundbreaking research on behavioral market systems before most doctoral students complete their second year. He looked genuinely puzzled. Frankly, many of us expected her to become one of the country's leading economists. Ethan slowly shifted his attention back toward Claire. For the first time all evening, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Claire, however, merely lowered her gaze modestly. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. But Ethan Caldwell was no longer looking at a waitress. Professor Richard Lawson remained beside the table for several moments, seemingly unaware that he had transformed the atmosphere of the entire restaurant. Ethan Caldwell sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Around them, conversations resumed cautiously, although many guests continued listening discreetly. Claire Bennett stood quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. Professor Lawson smiled warmly. "Claire, several colleagues still discuss your market adaptation paper. I referenced it in my graduate seminar last semester." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. "That is very kind, Professor, but I have been away from academia for a long time." "Talent does not disappear," Professor Lawson replied gently. "It simply waits." With that, he excused himself and returned to his table. Silence settled once again. Ethan slowly lifted his coffee cup but did not drink. "You studied economics at Columbia?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir." "Graduate level?" Claire nodded. "Doctoral program?" Ethan stared at her. "And you left?" "Yes." "Why?" Claire's expression remained composed. "Life required something different." Ethan leaned back. "That answer tells me absolutely nothing." Claire offered a faint smile. "Not every story belongs in a dining room." For the first time all evening, Ethan looked almost embarrassed. "Almost." "Fair enough," he said quietly. Yet curiosity had clearly replaced irritation. Several minutes passed. Claire resumed serving other guests while Ethan reviewed documents spread across his table. However, something had changed. Each time Claire passed nearby, Ethan found himself watching her. She moved through the dining room with effortless calm. She remembered names, preferences, dietary restrictions, anniversaries, and conversations from previous visits. Elderly guests smiled when she approached. A nervous young couple celebrating an engagement visibly relaxed after speaking with her. Even the kitchen staff seemed steadier in her presence. Ethan had spent decades leading organizations employing thousands of people. He recognized competence immediately. Claire possessed an unusual kind of it. Nearly an hour later, Ethan signaled for another coffee. Claire approached. "Would you like dessert this evening?" Ethan shook his head. "No, thank you." He hesitated. "May I ask you something else?" "Of course." Ethan folded his hands. "Suppose someone offered you an opportunity tomorrow. A genuine opportunity. Would you take it?" Claire considered the question carefully. "That depends." "On what?" "On the cost." Ethan frowned. "Opportunity usually creates value." Claire nodded. "Sometimes. But sometimes it requires abandoning something even more valuable." Ethan was about to respond when one of his assistants hurried back toward the table carrying a tablet. "Mr. Caldwell, the Singapore investors moved the conference call forward. They need a decision tonight." Ethan glanced at the screen and sighed heavily. Perfect timing. The assistant lowered his voice. "There is disagreement regarding the Asian market projections." Ethan looked irritated. "Again?" The assistant nodded nervously. Ethan rubbed his temples. "Fine. Open the file." Charts and financial forecasts appeared on the screen. Ethan studied them briefly before muttering under his breath. Claire politely stepped away. "Miss Bennett," Ethan suddenly called. Claire stopped. Ethan hesitated, clearly surprising even himself. You study behavioral economics, correct? Claire looked slightly puzzled. Among other subjects, yes. Ethan turned the tablet toward her. Purely out of curiosity, what do you think? Nearby diners immediately became quiet again. One assistant looked horrified. The other looked fascinated. Claire glanced toward the screen for only a few seconds. Then she looked at Ethan. These projections assume consumer confidence will recover uniformly across all regions. Ethan nodded cautiously. Correct. Claire shook her head gently. It will not. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Why? Claire pointed politely toward a chart. Your model treats post-recession purchasing behavior as primarily financial. It is not. It is emotional. She spoke softly but confidently. Trust recovery occurs at different speeds across cultures. Southeast Asian markets historically prioritize stability signals differently than North American markets. Ethan stared at her. Claire continued. Your revenue assumptions are approximately 12% too optimistic during the first 2 quarters. Complete silence returned. For the third time that evening. Ethan looked down at the screen. Slowly, his expression changed. Because for the first time in years, someone had challenged his analysis. And she was almost certainly right. Ethan Caldwell stared at the tablet screen in complete silence. Rain still traced shimmering lines down the tall restaurant windows while jazz music drifted softly through the Meridian room, yet for Ethan, the rest of the world seemed suddenly distant. Claire Bennett stood beside the table, perfectly composed, as though she had merely commented on the weather rather than challenged the financial assumptions behind a multi-billion-dollar expansion strategy. Ethan's 2 assistants exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Ethan looked up. 12%, he asked quietly. Claire nodded. Approximately. Ethan narrowed his eyes. You reached that conclusion in less than 30 seconds. Claire smiled faintly. You asked for an opinion, not a formal presentation. One of the assistants shifted nervously. Mr. Caldwell, we should probably continue this discussion privately. Ethan ignored him. His attention remained entirely fixed on Claire. Explain. Claire hesitated. Sir, you are having dinner. I am asking. Claire studied the chart again. Consumer confidence is not simply a financial indicator. It reflects emotional security. Families recovering from economic uncertainty often delay discretionary spending long after their financial conditions improve. Ethan listened without interrupting. Your projections assume uniform behavioral recovery across multiple regions, Claire continued. Historically, that rarely happens. People make decisions emotionally first and rationally second. Ethan slowly leaned back. Behavioral economics. Claire nodded. Primarily. Ethan was silent for several moments. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not politely. Not strategically. Genuinely. You know, he said quietly, my senior analyst spent 6 weeks arguing about this exact issue. Claire lowered her eyes modestly. Then they are probably more qualified than I am. Ethan almost laughed. At this moment, I am not entirely convinced. Nearby guests openly watched now. The atmosphere inside the dining room had transformed completely. Earlier that evening, many had witnessed a billionaire casually dismiss a waitress. Now they were witnessing something entirely different. Respect changing direction. Ethan closed the tablet and studied Claire carefully. Why are you here? He asked. Claire seemed unsurprised by the question. Working? No. Ethan shook his head. Why are you carrying coffee instead of teaching at Columbia or advising governments? Claire remained quiet. The rain outside intensified. Because life is not a straight line, she finally said softly. Ethan looked dissatisfied with the answer. You continue avoiding specifics. Claire offered a gentle smile. Some chapters take time to explain. Before Ethan could respond, Professor Lawson approached once again, preparing to leave. Claire, he said warmly, I hope you will attend the symposium next month. Claire looked surprised. Professor, I appreciate the invitation, but I do not think that would be appropriate. The professor frowned. Nonsense. Your perspective deserves to be heard. Ethan immediately looked interested. Symposium? Professor Lawson smiled. The Global Leadership Forum. Columbia hosts it annually. International economists, business leaders, and policy experts attend. He looked directly at Claire. Several of us have spent years hoping she would return. Claire seemed almost uncomfortable. That was another life. Professor Lawson shook his head gently. No, Claire. It was your life. There is a difference. With that, he departed. Silence returned. Ethan watched Claire for a long moment. Another life, he repeated quietly. Claire nodded once. Yes. Ethan glanced around the elegant dining room. Forgive me for saying this, but it seems like a tremendous waste. Claire's expression softened rather than hardened. Perhaps. She looked toward an elderly couple dining near the fireplace. Or perhaps some things simply matter more for a while. Ethan followed her gaze. The elderly woman was struggling slightly with her menu. Her husband patiently helped her read each line. Claire excused herself immediately and walked over, kneeling beside their table with practiced kindness. Within moments, both guests were smiling. Ethan watched silently. For years, he had evaluated people through measurable outcomes. Revenue. Growth. Influence. Efficiency. Yet as he observed Claire moving through the restaurant, he experienced an unfamiliar thought. Maybe he had been measuring the wrong things. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Caldwell realized that the woman he had tried to humiliate might possess something he himself had spent decades losing. The rain had finally begun to ease by the time Ethan Caldwell requested his check. The steady rhythm against the windows softened into occasional droplets sliding down the glass, leaving Manhattan wrapped in mist and reflected city lights. Inside the Meridian room, however, Ethan remained seated long after finishing dinner. His assistants had already left to prepare for the Singapore conference call. Yet Ethan showed no intention of leaving. Instead, he found himself watching Claire Bennett move through the restaurant with quiet efficiency. Every interaction seemed effortless. She spoke to guests with warmth. She remembered names. She anticipated needs before anyone asked. And somehow, despite the pressure of a crowded dining room, she never appeared hurried. Ethan had spent 30 years leading corporations built upon performance metrics, productivity models, and leadership evaluations. He had interviewed thousands of executives. Yet the woman carrying coffee across polished marble floors possessed a kind of presence he rarely encountered in boardrooms. Shortly before closing, Claire approached his table once more. Mr. Caldwell, may I bring anything else before the kitchen closes? Ethan looked up from his untouched coffee. Actually, yes. Claire waited politely. Sit down for 5 minutes. Claire looked genuinely surprised. Sir, I am working. Ethan nodded toward the nearly empty dining room. The restaurant closes in 20 minutes. Claire hesitated. Then, noticing that most guests had already departed and another server had begun clearing nearby tables, she accepted. She sat carefully across from him. 5 minutes, she said with a small smile. Ethan returned the smile faintly. Fair enough. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan leaned forward. Professor Lawson said you were one of Columbia's brightest students. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows. He has always been generous. He also said people expected extraordinary things from you. Claire remained silent. Ethan continued quietly. What happened? For the first time that evening, Claire did not answer immediately. The restaurant around them had grown almost completely silent. Chairs were being stacked in distant sections. Soft jazz still played overhead. Finally, Claire folded her hands together. My father became ill during my second year in the doctoral program, she said softly. Ethan listened without interruption. At first, everyone believed it was stress. Then memory problems began. Claire looked down. The diagnosis was frontotemporal dementia. Ethan said nothing. He recognized the name immediately. My mother had already passed away, Claire continued. There was no one else. She smiled sadly. Academic deadlines suddenly seemed much less important. Ethan lowered his eyes. You left Columbia. Claire nodded. I intended to return after a semester. She paused. Life had different plans. And your father? Ethan asked quietly. Claire's expression softened. He passed away 3 years ago. Silence settled between them. Ethan stared at the untouched coffee cup before him. I am sorry. Claire smiled gently. Thank you. Ethan looked away toward the city lights. My father died when I was 26. Claire seemed surprised. Ethan rarely discussed personal matters with anyone. I was building my second company, he continued. I delayed visiting him several times because I was negotiating financing. He paused. He died before I arrived. Claire remained silent. She understood that some regrets required no commentary. Ethan exhaled slowly. For years, I convinced myself that success justified everything. He looked directly at Claire. Perhaps I was wrong. Claire studied him quietly. Grief rarely follows logic, she said softly. We all make decisions with incomplete information. Ethan nodded. Slowly. Then he asked the question that had remained with him all evening. Do you regret it? Claire's answer came immediately. Never. Ethan looked surprised. Claire smiled. I regret many things. Exhaustion. Fear. Lost opportunities. She looked toward the darkened restaurant. But I never regret choosing my father. Ethan lowered his gaze. For the second time that evening, he found himself without an argument. Because somewhere deep inside, he knew she had just expressed a truth worth more than every company he had ever built. After leaving the Meridian room that night, Ethan Caldwell did something profoundly unusual. He canceled 2 meetings scheduled for the following morning. For nearly 3 decades, only medical emergencies had altered his calendar. His assistants were stunned. Ethan offered no explanation. He simply returned to his penthouse overlooking Central Park and remained awake long after midnight, staring out across the sleeping city. Rain still lingered against the glass. Yet his thoughts remained fixed on a quiet woman in a black uniform who had dismantled years of assumptions in a single evening. Shortly after 6 o'clock the next morning, Ethan sat alone in his study reviewing old photographs stored in a rarely opened drawer. There was one picture of his father standing beside a modest hardware store in Ohio. Another showed Ethan at 24, exhausted but smiling beside the first computer servers of his startup. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that somewhere between those photographs and the present, he had begun measuring people almost exclusively by achievement. The realization left him unsettled. Later that morning, while traveling to corporate headquarters, Ethan asked his chief of staff an unexpected question. Find out whether Claire Bennett ever published academic research. The chief of staff looked surprised but nodded. By lunchtime, a detailed file sat on Ethan's desk. He opened it immediately. The documents revealed a remarkable story. Claire Bennett had graduated summa cum laude before entering Columbia University's doctoral program with full funding. Her early research on behavioral market adaptation had attracted national attention. Several professors had described her as exceptional. One recommendation letter called her the most promising scholar in a generation. Ethan slowly turned each page. Then came the medical records attached through publicly available foundation documents. Frontotemporal dementia. Long-term caregiving. Financial hardship. Academic withdrawal. Ethan leaned back heavily in his chair. For 7 consecutive years, Claire had balanced caregiving responsibilities, multiple part-time jobs, and academic research before ultimately leaving the program entirely. There was no evidence that she had ever spoken publicly about those sacrifices. No interviews. No articles. No fundraising campaigns. She had simply disappeared from academic life and quietly cared for her father until his death. Ethan remained silent for a long time. He thought about all the people he had admired throughout his career. Entrepreneurs. Investors. Politicians. Industry leaders. Yet very few had willingly abandoned prestigious futures to care for another human being. By late afternoon, Ethan found himself rereading Professor Lawson's comments from the previous evening. Talent does not disappear. It simply waits. Something about that sentence stayed with him. Meanwhile, across town, Claire began another ordinary shift at the Meridian Room. She tied back her chestnut hair, adjusted her white apron, and greeted co-workers exactly as she had every day for years. Nothing in her routine suggested that a billionaire had spent the entire morning studying her abandoned academic career. Claire preferred it that way. She had long ago accepted that life rarely unfolded according to original plans. Yet she had also discovered something important during her father's illness. Human dignity did not depend upon titles. It lived in smaller things. Presence. Loyalty. Kindness. As the dinner service began, Claire noticed an elegant envelope waiting beside her employee locker. Confused, she opened it carefully. Inside was a formal invitation embossed with Columbia University's seal. The Global Leadership Forum. Guest speaker invitation. Claire stared at the document in disbelief. Attached was a handwritten note from Professor Lawson. The world still needs your voice. Claire sat quietly on the locker room bench, unable to move. She had not stood behind a podium in almost 8 years. Outside, the sounds of the restaurant continued normally. Orders. Laughter. Dishes. Life moving forward. Yet for Claire Bennett, a door she believed had closed forever had quietly opened once again. 3 weeks later, snow drifted gently across the Columbia University campus as scholars, diplomats, executives, and policymakers arrived for the annual Global Leadership Forum. The event had become one of the country's most respected gatherings on leadership, economics, and social change. Black cars lined the entrance. Television crews prepared equipment near the main auditorium. Inside, conversations unfolded in several languages beneath vaulted ceilings and historic architecture. Ethan Caldwell adjusted the cuffs of his dark navy suit as he entered the building. He attended the forum every year, usually as both keynote sponsor and panel contributor. Normally, he approached the event with complete confidence. This year felt different. Ever since his conversation with Claire Bennett, an unfamiliar sense of reflection had followed him everywhere. He found himself questioning decisions, priorities, even his own definition of success. As Ethan greeted colleagues and investors, his chief of staff approached carrying the event program. "Your panel begins at 11 o'clock, she said. After the opening keynote. Ethan accepted the program absent-mindedly. Then he stopped walking. His eyes remained fixed on a single line printed near the top of the page. Opening keynote speaker, Claire Bennett. Ethan looked up immediately. Claire Bennett? His chief of staff nodded. Apparently she was a last-minute addition requested by Columbia's economics department. Several faculty members strongly advocated for her. Ethan stared at the program for several seconds. He had known Professor Lawson hoped Claire would return to academic circles. He had not expected this. Around him, distinguished guests continued arriving, unaware that one of the nation's most powerful business leaders had suddenly become completely distracted. 30 minutes later, the auditorium filled completely. More than 1,000 attendees occupied the seats. Additional guests stood along the walls. The atmosphere carried the quiet anticipation reserved for significant moments. Ethan sat near the front beside university trustees and international business leaders. Yet his attention remained focused entirely on the stage. The lights dimmed. The moderator stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, our opening speaker embodies the very principles this forum seeks to explore. Her work in behavioral economics challenged conventional assumptions years ago. More importantly, her personal journey reminds us that leadership is not always visible. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Please welcome Ms. Claire Bennett. The audience applauded politely. Then Claire walked onto the stage. Ethan forgot to breathe. Gone was the black restaurant uniform and white apron. Claire wore a simple but elegant navy dress. Her hair rested softly across her shoulders. She carried no notes. She needed none. More striking than her appearance, however, was her presence. Calm. Confident. Quietly powerful. She stood beneath the stage lights exactly as she had stood inside the Meridian Room weeks earlier. Completely comfortable in her own dignity. The applause gradually faded. Claire looked across the audience. For a brief moment, her eyes found Ethan seated near the front. Surprise crossed her face. Then she smiled gently before turning toward the audience. Thank you for being here, she began. Her voice carried effortlessly throughout the auditorium. Many years ago, I believed leadership belonged exclusively to people with titles, influence, and authority. The room became perfectly silent. Life eventually taught me something different. Ethan sat motionless. Around him, executives reached for notebooks. Diplomats leaned forward. Professors listened intently. The waitress he had once dismissed was now commanding the attention of an entire auditorium filled with some of the most accomplished people in the world. And for the second time since meeting Claire Bennett, Ethan Caldwell realized he had profoundly underestimated her. Claire Bennett stood quietly beneath the stage lights, allowing the silence to settle before continuing. Beyond the enormous windows of the auditorium, snow drifted gently across the Columbia campus, but inside, more than 1,000 people remained completely still. For many years, Claire said softly, I believed leadership meant being the person with the loudest voice in the room. She paused. Then life gave me a different education. Ethan Caldwell sat motionless in the front row. Around him, executives, diplomats, and academics listened with absolute attention. Claire continued. My father became seriously ill while I was pursuing my doctoral studies. Overnight, my priorities changed. Research papers became medical appointments. Academic conferences became pharmacy visits. Future plans became daily acts of care. Several audience members lowered their eyes. Claire's voice remained calm, never dramatic. At first, I believed I had failed. I watched former classmates build careers while I learned how to navigate hospital corridors and insurance paperwork. She smiled gently. But somewhere during those years, I discovered something extraordinary. Human worth does not disappear when achievement pauses. The auditorium remained silent. Our culture often rewards visibility. Titles. Status. Wealth. Influence. Yet some of the most important leadership in this world happens quietly. It happens in homes, hospitals, classrooms, and places where no cameras exist. Ethan felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. Claire was not simply delivering a speech. She was describing a truth he had spent years overlooking. Claire slowly walked across the stage. A few weeks ago, someone asked me why I was still working in a restaurant. A faint smile appeared across the audience. The question itself was not unkind. But it revealed something deeper. We often assume that occupation tells us everything about a person. She paused. It does not. Complete silence filled the hall. The waitress serving dinner may be caring for a parent. The janitor cleaning an office may hold advanced degrees. The elderly neighbor living quietly across the street may carry extraordinary stories. Claire looked across the audience. Uniforms tell us what people do. They rarely tell us who people are. Ethan lowered his eyes. Every word felt uncomfortably personal. Claire continued softly, leadership begins the moment we stop measuring people by external symbols and start recognizing their inherent dignity. Several audience members nodded visibly. Others quietly wiped away tears. Claire concluded without raising her voice. The greatest mistake we can make is assuming that silence means absence of value. Some of the strongest people in this world are simply carrying responsibilities we cannot see. She smiled gently. And sometimes, the quiet ones are not ordinary at all. For several seconds after she finished, no one moved. Then, slowly, an elderly professor stood and began applauding. A moment later, another person rose. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was standing. Applause thundered throughout the hall. Diplomats, scholars, business leaders, and students remained on their feet, many visibly emotional. Ethan stood as well. He applauded longer than anyone around him. Yet unlike the others, he was not simply applauding the speech. He was acknowledging a lesson. Weeks earlier, inside the Meridian room, he had attempted to define Claire Bennett by her uniform. Now, standing among 1,000 accomplished people honoring her wisdom, Ethan understood the magnitude of his mistake. For perhaps the first time in many years, the billionaire who had spent a lifetime evaluating others realized that he himself still had much to learn. The standing ovation continued for nearly 2 full minutes. Even after Claire Bennett stepped away from the podium, applause still echoed throughout the auditorium. Scholars approached one another with thoughtful expressions. Executives quietly discussed her remarks. Students stood inspired, many wiping tears from their eyes. Claire accepted congratulations graciously, yet she seemed far more comfortable listening than receiving praise. As guests gradually moved toward the reception hall, Ethan Caldwell remained standing near his seat. For several moments, he simply watched Claire speaking with professors and students near the stage. The woman he had first encountered behind a coffee tray now stood at the center of one of the nation's most respected academic gatherings. Yet what struck Ethan most was not her accomplishment. It was that she appeared exactly the same. Humble. Calm. Unchanged by recognition. Eventually, Ethan made his way through the crowd. Claire noticed him immediately. She smiled warmly. "Mr. Caldwell." Ethan returned the smile. "Claire." For the first time since meeting her, he used her first name without formality or distance. They stood quietly for a moment while people passed around them. Snow continued falling softly beyond the tall windows overlooking the campus. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Your speech was extraordinary." Claire shook her head gently. "Thank you. I was terrified." Ethan laughed softly. "No one could tell." Claire smiled. "Years of serving difficult dinner guests prepared me well." Both laughed quietly. Then Ethan grew serious. "There is something I need to say." Claire waited patiently. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes. "The evening we met, I treated you unfairly." He paused. "I made assumptions about your intelligence, your ambition, and your value based entirely on your job." His voice remained steady, but sincere. "I was wrong." Claire remained silent. Ethan continued. I have spent my entire career believing that achievement reveals character. He glanced around the crowded reception hall. You reminded me that character often exists long before achievement becomes visible. Claire studied him quietly. Thank you for saying that. Ethan exhaled slowly. I also owe you an apology. Claire smiled gently. Apology accepted. Ethan looked surprised. That was quick. Claire laughed softly. Holding resentment requires energy. I prefer to invest mine elsewhere. Ethan shook his head with admiration. You truly are remarkable. Claire looked out toward the snow-covered campus. No, she said quietly. I am ordinary. She turned back toward him. Most people are carrying invisible responsibilities, private grief, or unfinished dreams. We simply rarely stop long enough to notice. Ethan nodded slowly. They walked together toward a large window overlooking the courtyard below. Students crossed the snow-covered pathways carrying books beneath glowing campus lights. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Ethan said, several weeks ago, I told you that people usually remain exactly where they are. Claire looked at him. Ethan smiled faintly. I have been thinking about that conversation ever since. Claire raised an eyebrow playfully. And? Ethan looked out across the campus. I realized something. He paused. Sometimes people are not standing still at all. Sometimes they are carrying someone else. Claire said nothing. She simply smiled. The silence between them felt comfortable. Peaceful. At last, Ethan extended his hand. Perhaps we could continue our conversation sometime. Preferably without my embarrassing myself. Claire accepted the handshake warmly. I would like that. As they stood beside the window watching snow fall across Columbia University, Ethan understood something profound. Wealth could purchase influence, comfort, and opportunity. But it could never replace humility. And Claire Bennett had taught him a lesson no boardroom, investment, or business school ever had. The world changes the moment we stop measuring people by their uniforms.